and today let's cover 3 fantastic, amazing games to resurge our love for gaming. Focusing too much on the negatives of modern gaming, while important to highlight, it makes us forget that gaming is a hobby we love, which is why we're so easily rage-baited into the next controversy.
Dude, how do these keep getting made? BlackRock, this is how we... never mind. I'm not gonna Fed post. But if you just look at history, I'll put it this way. If you look at human history, when one man decides enough is enough and does something, okay, it would have happened by now.
And I was playing a few games over the weekend and I was totally engrossed in the story these games created, even though there was no story in a traditional sense. The story of these games, if you can call it that, was not crafted by the people who hate games or the subject matter which the game is based on. Instead, the games which I was playing didn't have the story, or at least didn't have a main plot which you would follow until the credits rolled. Games like this really hit a niche with me, and it's my own actions from the gameplay that forged the narrative that is unique to me alone. This makes the journey in these experiences far more personal and way more memorable than some games with a handcrafted narrative that simply string the player along for the ride. So let's get into it. Now, Mount & Blade Warband is the quintessential make-your-own-story game. Aside from the very first interaction, after being jumped by some thugs, Emergent gives you a quest to gather some men and take out the bandits at their camp. But you could ignore this quest right away and go about your own journey in any direction you see fit. And I'm sure many people will just align themselves with one of the monarchs of the land, do some busy work for them, eventually gain the respect of the king and be granted some land in the form of a city, castle, but most likely initially just some border village that's been recently looted and burnt to the ground. But as an honourable character, you can invest in your fiefdoms, build schools, town halls or mills, and as your renown grows in the land, so does your capacity to have a bigger army, be granted more land, and eventually become the king's most trusted and loyal vassal. And after this gameplay loop, you might wonder what comes next. Do you decide it's your ambition to spend the money you've earned on starting a business enterprise? For several thousand gold, you can start up your own olive oil press, a brewery, or even a lavish dye works. And the systems of these are quite deep, so it really feels like you're becoming a business baron in this medieval world, slowly but surely becoming so rich and powerful that you begin to wonder, why do you even bother to serve the king that hands you lands like a dog waiting for scraps at the dining table? And so it becomes time to take what's yours. And at this stage, you've travelled the world, met many interesting characters who join you, not the kingdom you've aligned with, they are loyal to you. Similar to how Roman legions in the late Republic era, they became more loyal to their commander than the cries of the Senate thousands of miles away. And so, maybe because of spite, indifference, or just a belief that it was your destiny to take it all for yourself, you decide to do exactly that. And all of a sudden, because of the choices you've made, because of your standing in the world which you've been playing, the whole dynamic of the story which is unfolding before you completely changes. And so you decide to start your own kingdom. You even decide its name, and even the banner which flies on the battlefield. And this is the traditional path many people take, and in doing so, no story is going to be alike, and how it's accomplished will take many different paths depending on how you play the game. You might side with different factions, you might recruit different groups, or maybe you just have Jarl Olaf as a prisoner for over 150 in-game days, souring your relationship with them forever. Warband lets you truly immerse yourself as the character of your own creation. One of the things I like to do is to make a character who resembles Genghis Khan. I'll create an army of horsemen as fast as possible, and I'll simply raid every village who dares to get in my way. After burning, looting and pillaging, I managed to accrue a small fortune in a very short period of time. And after putting all my skill points into anything that will make my army bigger, I decide to take on a bigger challenge and take a castle for myself. And if you're not aligned with any kingdom, the castle will go immediately to yourself. And being a warlord in this world, you're rewarded with every other faction going to war with you. It wasn't going to be easy, but sometimes the harder paths are the most rewarding and interesting. And I did play the new Mount & Blade, the Bannerlord, when it came out, but it was a bit too buggy and not very well optimized at the time. I assume this has all been patched out, but initially it seemed just like an HD remake of the first game with a couple of new interesting features. But the original Mount & Blade still scratches the itch of this type of experience, and what's more is that there's some super easy to install overhaul mods so you can experience your story you craft in a setting of your own choosing. Whether it's Lord of the Rings, ancient Rome, or maybe the dreams of a schizophrenic madman, there is plenty to choose from to immerse yourself in. The story you create by simply playing the game is infinitely more interesting than the majority of these story-focused games that are being released these days. And let's move on to the next game, World of Warcraft, but specifically classic World of Warcraft. Every expansion that released following the base game, it began to focus on an overarching story, which is fine as it gives the expansion a sense of agency and purpose, but what I don't like about them as they move forward is that there's a greater focus on you as the player, as a saviour, as the hero. Not an adventurer among many, but you specifically are a critical asset to the war effort to defeat whatever villain is on the box cover. But in classic Warcraft, there is no real overarching narrative to guide you. There's no world-ending bad guy. You're just entering the world as a fresh-faced noob with no idea where your travels and adventures might lead you. There are many quests with their own stories which are generally tied to the zone you're in, with exception to some excellently crafted stories that span several zones, levels, and lead to a satisfying conclusion. But within these quests, the main story is not the text, it's actually how you go about the quest. Are you just a noble paladin, crushing your enemies with your hammer? Or maybe just a cunning rogue who stealths your way through dangerous parts of the world? And maybe you don't even bother doing many of the quests, you're just happy to spend your time travelling the world, gathering resources, and levelling your professions instead. Or maybe you're like me, and the best times are the stories you create by forming groups, travelling the world to a dungeon across the continent, and succeeding in this endeavour, and beating the last boss. And this can all take a couple of hours to complete in just one sitting. And if you've played classic Warcraft, what memories do stick out to you? Is it the inspiring quest where you've killed murlocs to collect their fins, or was it pulling together a rather unorthodox group, where some people are under-leveled, you venture to the dungeon, you know it's going to take a big chunk of your evening to get through to the end? And I made a good amount of screenshots of my time in classic Warcraft when it came out in 2019, and it illustrates a story in itself, and the stories within these quests are just mere backdrops to my own story of leveling up in the world. Entering the world for the very first time. And this was back when I was working a job I hated, so I could only play for an hour or so before needing to go to bed. But during this time I didn't have much going for me, and so I just invested so much time leveling up in this massive world. I ended up joining a guild, the Scottish Boomers, which was very convenient. Everyone seemed like a local around me. There was some guy who told me where he lived, and it was literally about a 5-minute walk, but he seemed like a total madman, so I made no effort to ever meet up with him in real life, and I think that was for the best, especially when the guild disintegrated and broke up. And after playing for hours and hours, you eventually pick up your mount, investing what gold I had so I could ride around the map slightly faster than everyone else. But we ended up leveling up together across many different dungeons and many different groups, all within the Scottish Boomers, and it was just such a great story. And it was just great when I would log in, immediately invited to a group of people who had been leveling up with for days and days, and we would just power through dungeons again and again. And this was a memorable experience I had with this random guy that I never spoke to ever again. We were looking for this clue under a bridge for this quest that was essentially like a riddle that would lead you across the map, and after helping each other out finding the first clue that was hard to see, we decided it'd be a lot more fun if we raced each other across the map to see who could get the next clue first. The whole thing was essentially neck and neck. At one point we took 2 different flight paths thinking it would be faster for either one of us, but in the end we made it together, and the last part of the quest was to jump off this waterfall together where we got the screenshot and we were rewarded with a nice 14 slot bag. But I was rewarded with more than that. This took place about 5 years ago, and it is such an unremarkable experience, but the fact that I remember it so vividly really goes to show that this was a story that had real meaning behind it. Can you remember a game that you played in 2019, 2020, and you remember the story from start to finish? Where it's stories like this, in this game, that I've crafted myself, these are the ones that stick in my mind forever. And I could go on about this, I might make another video about a tribute to Warcraft, but let's just move on to the next game. So finally, let's look at an absolute classic, Medieval 2. Now this take could probably be applicable to many of the Total War games, or really any strategy game where you control soldiers on a big map. And I was going to use Rome Total War, the original, as the third game to mention in this video, but Medieval 2 has a couple of features that make the story of your own campaigns that much more interesting.
It is time for the armies of Christendom to put aside their differences and unite under one banner, the sign of the cross, and give back God's children what is rightfully theirs, or die trying.
So firstly, the Crusades, they make everything better, and not just in-game. I've got a fond memory of a campaign I played when I was working from home during the COVID lockdowns, which again is about 5 years ago now. Considering that there is no real story to follow, you're just playing the campaign and making your own choices of what to do. Considering there is no story to follow, the fact that I remember it so vividly, the events of this particular campaign, it really proves to me that the stories that you can create in games, where the gameplay tools available, it lets you craft a truly memorable experience that surpasses the storytelling of games that are trying to be more like a movie you play instead of a game with a narrative to enhance the experience. Very quickly, in my campaign, I played as the Holy Roman Empire. We're slap bang in the middle of Europe, surrounded by everyone who hates me. Quite early on in the campaign, I was on the ropes after losing one too many battles and lost some serious territory to my north to the French. The French had superior troops, they had the dismounted feudal knights, when I was probably still using just some cheap spearmen. And I think I was just busy investing in pointless infrastructure projects when my borders were collapsing, when I should have been putting all the efforts into military. But I knew exactly where these French troops were coming from. With the line of sight of my spy, I could see a citadel deep in their mainland, and so I decided to put all my efforts into a very risky maneuver, which would make or break my campaign. I summoned the best army I could, pulled troops out of my border towns, leaving them defenceless, and I marched deep into the enemy lands to take their biggest castle. I knew if I took the castle, I could recruit the same powerful knights from there, and then I could invade the remaining French territories from within, like some sort of Germanic cancer. It was like a medieval version of the Blitzkrieg. You just keep rolling on and on until you hit Paris and beyond, and then the remaining French territories are just ripe for the taking. But these actions got me excommunicated. The Pope didn't really appreciate an entire Catholic faction being decimated from a fellow Catholic faction in a handful of years. And I didn't appreciate this disrespect from the Pope, and I knew I would need to repay his action in time. So while on a previous crusade, I ended up taking many priests to turn the Levant region into a Christian nation again, and in doing so, this made some of these great holy men ideal candidates to be the next Pope. But the current Pope is still a young man by Pope standards, and has some very peculiar traits, so if I wanted to take the papacy for myself, the current Pope had to go. And so, once my borders were in control, instead of spending all my remaining money invading everyone in all directions, I focused on building a very different type of army, an army of assassins. And after training these assassins by taking out smaller and easier targets, they were ready, or at least with how many I had, I was statistically more likely to be successful, and with a bit of save scumming, the Pope had no chance, and very soon I would be leading the papacy. And after that, the Holy Roman Empire reign only accelerated, and my work from home adventure was unstoppable. And it's these small twists and turns in the gameplay experience in all the examples I've gone over make these experiences more memorable, more personal, and just way more engaging. Video game stories should enhance the experience. Games are gameplay first. The amount of games that come out to tell a story and then build a game around it are usually not as compelling. The gameplay is boring, and they focus on telling a story with an abundance of cutscenes just to make the experience a movie that you can occasionally interact with. Video games also have the ability to create worlds in a more compelling and interactive way, a way that films simply cannot, because you can explore every corner of any room if you choose to do so. This allows games with somewhat mediocre stories to become far more interesting if the world they take place in and the gameplay experience to support the narrative is the focus of the game's design. This is why Oblivion is way more interesting than Starfield. Both games have a pretty basic plot, but because Starfield's world is so boring and uninteresting, Oblivion is just way more interesting to explore and to stumble into your own adventures so easily. Even if some of the world structure is copy-paste, it's just infinitely more engaging. Some game stories that stand on their own which I really do like the Deus Ex games, Old and New, Gears of War, Fallout New Vegas, Resident Evil, the Mass Effect series of course, and I'm currently playing Ghost of Tsushima right now, which so far, the story is beginning to be the main driving force as the gameplay loop is becoming a bit stale, but we'll see how this pans out. But what about yourself? What games have you enjoyed where the experience itself told a more compelling story than some big budget slop that we're seeing these days? My channel's still more of an experiment to try learn how to make and edit videos, so I'm just at the stage creating whatever idea comes to mind and creating it. And I'm sure some of my videos are striking a few nerves, especially the last one, which caused the subs to drop big time, well at least for me. But whether people don't care for that content or are actually fans of the people I was critiquing, it's hard to say. But I do hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and until next time.